You're listening to episode 264 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Shinzen joins us to speak about the science of enlightenment, how meditation works. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. What does enlightenment mean to you? Opinions may vary from a traditional view of the complete extinguishing of samsara to a more secular interpretation about the attenuation of reactivity. And to make it more complex and interesting, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive concepts, though of course the devil's in the details. But the fact remains, if you're on a Buddhist path, enlightenment has pinged your radar, and what that means to you is a valid question. Shinzen became fascinated with Asian culture while a teenager in Los Angeles. He later enrolled in a PhD program in Buddhist studies at the University of Wisconsin. Eventually, he went to Asia and did extensive training in each of the three major Buddhist traditions. Upon returning to the United States, his academic interests shifted to burgeoning dialogue between Eastern meditation and Western science. Shinzen is known for his innovative, interactive, algorithmic approach to mindfulness, a system specifically designed for use in pain management, recovery support, and as an adjunct to psychotherapy. He leads meditation retreats throughout North America and has helped establish numerous mindfulness centers and programs. He also consults widely on meditation-related research in both the clinical and basic science domains. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Asura's Enlightenment tea. Our guest today is Shinzen. Shinzen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks.
Very nice to be having you here. For those who recall and have been listening to the podcast for a while, or if you haven't, Shinzen first joined us in episode 119 to talk about meditation, pain, and science, and then again in episode 176, along with Vince Horn and our friend Mark Nickelbein, to talk about community in the virtual world. And I'll be linking those to the episode page. But right now we're here to talk with Shinzen about something new and something I personally have been waiting for a long time. He has a new book coming out. And I want to, just before we dive into the book itself, talk a little bit with Shinzen about your approach to meditation, how you would describe it, because it's perhaps a little different than other teachers. Tell us about that.
Well, the book is called The Science of Enlightenment, and there are sort of two sides to how science can be of benefit to the meditating world. One is that as time goes on, neuroscience will tell us new and important things about how meditation works on a biophysical level. So that's sort of one aspect of the science of enlightenment. And that's something, as you know, that I have great enthusiasm and optimism that given enough time, science will not only come up with things that are new about how meditation works, but will come up with things that are very useful, that will accelerate the process and perhaps democratize the deeper experiences that at present take decades of work by a dedicated small group. Well, maybe it'll be just a couple years and by most humans, because we've found a way of accelerating the process. That I'm not saying that will happen, but that's one thing that could happen, say, in the next century or so. So that's one sort of science of enlightenment. But the other side to the science of enlightenment, and what the book is mostly about, is the issue that you brought up. You said, what's distinctive about the way that I like to teach mindfulness? What's distinctive is that I would say that my approach is informed by the spirit of science. So there's a kind of spirit of science. It's a way to think about things that is rigorous, it's precise, it pays a lot of attention to clear definitions and well-defined procedures that have the form of an algorithm that loops and branches. There's a kind of spirit of science. And because I've studied science, it is second nature to me to think that way. And I've developed a style of teaching meditation that is informed by the spirit of science. The idea being that if we're willing to pay the price of being careful about our language and mastering a certain amount of terminology and some concepts that may have a bit of subtlety, if we're willing to pay that price up front, then we can work smarter with our practice and get industrial strength effects without necessarily exposing ourselves to the intense and sometimes brutal practices that would be associated with traditional monastic training. So the idea is to bring that spirit of clarity and rigor into the formulation so that ordinary people can get monastic levels of transformation without having to commit to years and years and years of intense, challenging, renunciate practice.
So the book has been a long time in the making. Tell us about what got in. What do you say in there?
Well, it's based on a CD series that was originally a tape series that I made for the Sounds True Studios many, many years ago. They brought me in, maybe 20 years ago or so, and they had me for a week, all day, talk to a small audience. It was the same audience every day, extemporize, and basically download everything I knew about meditation. to that group. And then they took those hours and hours of tapes and narrowed it down into a tape series that then became a CD series that was named The Science of Enlightenment, which is where we got the name for the book, obviously. And that CD series has always done very, very well. It's just been a perennial, I guess a cult classic might be a term that comes to mind. It was an example of bringing the spirit of science into the teaching. I tried to have that be the way I presented things. So things were very, very clear. And people found that it sort of connected the dots for them, that a whole lot of disparate areas, differing traditions, differing terminologies, differing claims suddenly sort of fell into place because of the unified perspective that I was able to create. And the way I created that perspective in the CD series was by, first of all, defining terms very carefully, and then building connections by showing relationships between the terms. So you could have an integrated sense of contemplation across cultures and throughout history all over the world, how this sort of all hangs together. So people found that the CD series had that effect. And I would say probably half the people that come to my retreats, when we ask them what brought you here, they would say, well, I listened to the Science of Enlightenment CD series. So because that was so popular, Sounds True wanted to make it into a book. So they approached me about 10 years ago. Let's transcribe it, and then we'll just do a little mix and match and slice and dice, and hey, we'll have a book. But it turned out it wasn't that simple, because in the intervening years, I had discovered new things, and I had developed new approaches. So that in the end, it turned out that there were a lot of things, new things, that I wanted to say that I hadn't said in the CD series. And so we ended up generating new content. So about half of the book is based on the general paradigm of the CD series. And the other half is everything I learned in the intervening years. And that's new, particularly around the paradigm of the nature of consciousness in terms of expansion and contraction, all that sort of stuff. That was new content that we put in.
And this scientific approach that you're taking with things, this precision that I agree with you is often lacking in contemplative practice and the teaching of contemplative practice. Why do you see this approach as so important in today's selection of meditation options?
I would say, in general, people should choose whatever meditation approach works for them. I'm not a believer that there is some dramatically better way to practice that works for almost everyone. It's been my experience that different approaches work for different people at different times in their career. So I just, in general, say each approach has strong points and it has weak points, and find what works for you. The strong point of my approach is that by being clear, you can get a lot of bang for the buck. You can get deep experiences without having to necessarily go through intensity of practice. That would be the payoff. Basically, work smarter. There was a interview I once heard with a Japanese baseball player, and they asked him to compare baseball in the U.S. and baseball in Japan. And he said something interesting. He said, well, the Americans are stronger, but I think we Japanese play a smarter game. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Japanese Zen training is samurai boot camp, which sometimes merges into samurai torture chamber, but it does get results, okay? But it's very, very intense. So I was looking, most people are not going to allocate 10 years to put themselves through that kind of intensity. So I'm looking for a way of working smarter, playing a smarter game where, well, maybe you won't get identical results because, hey, monastic training, it does work and it has a long history. But the idea would be that at least you could realistically expect to get, say, Kensho, which would be an initial kind of realization experience. You could expect to get that realistically within a few years without going to a monastery by just working in a smarter and more systematic way. That would be the hope. That would be the ideal. I don't know that I would claim I've achieved that, but that's what I was sort of working towards. Now, the downside, though, there's definitely a downside to my approach. And I think it's important for any teacher to be clear about the pros and the cons of their approach, not just to compare their best with the other guy's worst, which is what people tend to do if they're trying to sell their spiritual wares in the marketplace. So the downside is most people are not really used to mastering a technical vocabulary. They probably didn't like doing that in school unless they were geeks, okay? And now they're sort of being asked to learn a number of terms, and the definitions are sort of subtle, and there are lots of choices because basically I don't present people with a system of meditation. I present people with a systematic way to understand all systems of meditation. So that means it's very comprehensive, which is great, but it also means it's very complex. And most people just want, hey, just give me something simple. What am I supposed to do? Oh, breathe and smile. Anything else? No, just breathe and smile. Okay, that's good. I got it. I'm going to breathe and smile. Now, that might work for someone. If it does, that's fine. Now, that's simple, okay? My thing is not simple, and people in general, there's a little bit of a learning curve, getting used to, oh my God, we're talking about, all these different approaches, and they're all possible, and which one should I do? And I've got to learn all this new vocabulary. And so that's a barrier to entry. Another possible downside to the way I teach is that I like to teach people from the get-go to work with a very broad object. I don't start people off preferentially on the breath. Not that I have anything wrong, that I have anything against breath practice. I have a whole free workshop on the internet, an entire day where I lead you through nothing but breath as a path to enlightenment. But typically, I start people off working very broad with an open presence where you're noting whatever comes up, and you're doing that walking around and with your eyes open. Well, that's a lot to keep track of. And people can find that a little bit, it doesn't feel like meditation. I'm just sort of thinking and trying to keep track of stuff, and it's agitating and effortful and stirs up my mind. And I thought meditation was going to get me into this deep, blissful state, etc. So because I do have people start with a very broad focus, that also involves a little bit of a learning curve that you have to get used to that. And it may not seem deep and blissful like counting your breath or something like that. But the reason I start people out that way is I want them to have a technique that they can use in daily life so that they get MMM, maximum meditation mileage, out of their life. And they don't have to go off and, sit down and close their eyes and, om or something in order to be meditating. They can
You're starting
meditate.
them where they are and how they are in their daily life.
Yes, but that's a little bit of a steep place to start. So I would say that the downside of my approach is it involves some complexity and subtlety. There's a lot of choices, and that takes a little getting used to. And I try to teach people to do techniques in daily life while they're driving the car or having a conversation. And initially, those techniques involve untangling see, inner and outer, see, hear, feel. And at first, that untangling may not sort of, quote, taste like the deep state that people think meditation is supposed to be. Now, of course, the reason I've made those choices is if you're willing to put up with the effort that it takes to think clearly about the process and be careful in your language to learn how to sling a lingo and say what you mean, if you're willing to do that, you may be able to get a lot more industrial strength without having to go through, these sort of horrific ordeals of traditional training. And if you're willing to initially work to learn how to note any and all experience, it might not at first seem so deep, but it will eventually allow you to be deep under ordinary activities. So there is a payoff down the line, but the barrier at the beginning might be a little steep for people, and I have to be honest about that.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you is in your own years of practice and in the learnings you've made since there was the initial Sounds True cassette program to the publishing of the book, you'd found new things yourself. I'm wondering if you could tell us what's some of the things that you've discovered that have been most helpful to you in your own practice?
I would say the discovery that the sense of self can be analyzed into just three components: inner, see, hear, feel, by which I mean mental image, mental talk, and body emotion. I would say that's a major discovery. And it is actually unique to my way of teaching. So the core, or one of the core discoveries of the historical Buddha was the notion that when you take the sense of self and break it down into its components and then stop grasping onto those components, then those components cease being a prison and you're liberated from the perception that self is a thing. Now, this is expressed in early Buddhism mostly in terms of something called the five aggregates. So there are in English, the five skandhas. Skandha in Sanskrit, khandha in Pali, usually translated aggregate in English. So the idea was that when you untangle the perception of self as thing, you'll discover that it's just these five elements. And when you stop grasping onto them, then you get the paradigm shift that we call stream entry or kensho, where you realize there never actually was a thing inside you called the self. But if you look up the five aggregates, you'll find that they do not lend themselves very readily to meditation. First of all, it's pretty hard to understand what some of those terms mean. Just look up the Wikipedia article on the five aggregates, and it's sort of like, what the hell is this? What are they talking about here? So the terms are a little hard to even understand what they're referring to. And some of them, they overlap. They're not crisp Aristotelian categories. They're not the crisp, clear categories that a scientist would want to work with. They're not orthogonal. They don't represent independent dimensions always. The terms are ambiguous. And some of them are really not possible for a beginning meditator to observe. A beginning meditator cannot observe their subconscious habit forces, their samskaras. A very advanced meditator can, but you can't at the beginning. So you got 5 things that are ambiguously defined, are not crisp categories, are not easily amenable to direct sensory observation. And the notion is, well, you're supposed to realize that you're just those 5 things. And when you untangle that, then you'll get the core insight into no self. So what I've done is, I think that the basic idea is as good as gold. It's huge, major innovative discovery in the history of world spirituality. This idea, untangle and be free. It's distinctive to the Buddhist tradition. So the general principle is as good as gold. It's just that the 5 aggregates are not a very convenient way to implement that principle. So I applied Occam's razor. Is there a simpler formulation that will allow us to utilize the same insight, untangle and be free, divide and conquer? When you untangle the elements, then qualitative and quantitative distortions go away, and there's a freedom. I think that idea will absolutely stands the test of science and the test of time. So is there a simpler way to implement that idea? Well, I'm going to claim there is, by using mental image, mental talk, and body emotion as the 3 core components. Those are readily observable. Furthermore, it gives you the ability to make emotion tangible by detecting flavors and locations in the body. And it gives you the ability to make the mind observable by breaking it into a visual component, which is mental image, and an auditory component, which is your internal conversations. So now, instead of thought being
a very nebulous
concept,
thing.
Yeah, it's observable sensory events. Emotions are not ill-defined. They're well-defined qualities in the body. And it turns out that once you fully untangle those 3 elements, you get the same liberating effect that you would get from the traditional Buddhist practice based on the 5 aggregates, but with a much simpler and more approachable paradigm, and also one that I think can be mapped with neuroscience. So that's a major discovery. A second major discovery deals with what comes next. So after you've untangled yourself, you've known yourself as a sensory system, and that has set you free. Is there something more? And actually there is. You can then ask yourself, well, mental image, mental talk, and body emotion, what are they actually made of? Are they made of different substances or the same substance? Well, it turns out they're made of the same doing, which is an effortless, simultaneous expansion and contraction of space. And in point of fact, external sight, sound, and physical touch are made of that same doing. So now we come to an integrated paradigm where before, after, and surrounding every ordinary experience of the inner and outer world, there is this primordial perfection that is the nature of nature and therefore the nature of consciousness, which is the effortless efflux and reflux of space itself. And so after you've broken things down into see, hear, feel, which is an empowering discrimination, you realize that inner and outer see, hear, feel, both self and the world, are made out of the same stuff. And therefore, there is a connection that unites you to all of creation and leads to a natural sense of wanting to be of service to your larger identity. And that's the expansion-contraction paradigm. And I have a whole chapter on that in the book.
So let's shift a little bit. I want to share some of the things that you have on your sites, which we'll be listing on the episode page for this episode, I want you to talk about your home practice program and the facilitator training.
Well, these are two things I'm very pleased with. I set myself 3 goals in life, and I think I've achieved 2 of them, and I'm not sure that the third is achievable at this time, but maybe. The first goal was to come up with a universally acceptable formulation for the classic path to enlightenment based on mindfulness. In other words, a formulation that would work in concert with science and would not have any elements that would exclude any major human group. So independent of your religion or your politics or your philosophy or your culture, I wanted a formulation that would be comfortable for essentially everyone and yet be able to deliver the classic liberation results and also have a behavioral ethical component to it. And the unified mindfulness system, which is what I call my current paradigm, I would say I'm satisfied achieves that goal. So that was goal number 1. Goal number 2 is, okay, well, now you've got something that's universally acceptable to most human cultures, most human communities. Now let's make it universally available. How do we do that? Because most people can't get away from to a meditation retreat. Their lifestyle doesn't allow for it. They live in a country where that's not available. There's just a lot of reasons why most people would not have access to retreat practice. And basically, to be successful in this endeavor, you have the best possibility of success if you do both a little bit of daily formal practice and you do intensive retreat practice occasionally. So I needed a way to deliver retreat practice to anyone in the world, regardless of their financial situation, et cetera, and so I came up with a concept that I call the home practice program. And that's free conference call-based micro retreats, 4-hour modules, a weekend of those on the second weekend of every month. And that's a way that I can now say, if you have access to the internet and you have access to hands-free operation of a telephone, or you use the Skype to have free long-distance calling, I can say, if you have internet access, we can provide you with a lifetime of retreat practice, and you'll, no matter where you are in the world or what your financial or familial situation is, so it's universally available. So that's a delivery system, a universally available delivery system. And so that's the home practice program. And they can find out about that at shinzen.org. That was my second goal. First goal is universally acceptable presentation. The second goal was universally available delivery system. And then my third goal, that I don't know if I'll ever see in my lifetime, was to radically accelerate the process of meditation by bringing neuroscience, discovering things that no one knew in the past that make it easier for the masses of the world to have dramatic results quickly with practice. So that may happen, probably will happen in the next 100 years, as I mentioned initially. So I've achieved the first 2 of my goals, which is not too bad. And as I mentioned, I like to bring the spirit of science into the teaching of mindfulness. Mindfulness is just my word for meditation. And one of the things that I mentioned when I talked about the spirit of science was the notion of an algorithm, a process that loops and branches. And so my approach is algorithmic. It has you do something, and then if this happens, do this. If this happens, do that, to optimize your experience. And the best way to deliver that is to have a personal coach that can work with you interactively. So I call those facilitators. And at unifiedmindfulness.com, you'll see that we have a program where you can learn to be a facilitator in this approach. Also very pleased with that. I call my perspective unified mindfulness because it connects all the different pieces of contemplative-based psycho-spiritual growth that have developed over the centuries and across the world.
It's a unified field theory for meditation.
That's pretty much the goal that I would be working towards.
Shinzen, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
If you're listening to this, you probably have a practice, and I'm happy for you.
Everyone who's listening to this, thank you so much, Shinzen, for joining us. You can find out more about his work. 2 different sites I'm going to give to you, shinzen.org and unifiedmindfulness.com. And of course, I'll be linking those and a few other things on the episode page for this episode, as well as a link to Shinzen's new book. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.